Your person's late-night confession, you need to hear this. You know what's keeping them awake tonight while you're wondering if they even think about you anymore? It's you. And I need you to hear something that nobody else is going to tell you with this kind of honesty, because right now, while you're scrolling through your phone trying to distract yourself from the ache in your chest, there's someone else lying in the dark, staring at their ceiling, running their fingers over your name in their contacts, and not having the courage to press send. Let me sit with you for a moment, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who's watched this story unfold more times than I can count, who's seen God work in the spaces between silence and reconciliation, who knows that what feels like abandonment right now is sometimes just two people learning separate lessons that they'll need when they finally come together. Because here's what I've learned after years of walking alongside people through their deepest heartbreaks and their most unexpected reunions. The waiting isn't wasted if you're becoming someone different in the process. I'm not here to give you timelines or make promises about tomorrow, but I am here to tell you what's true right now, in this very moment, while you're feeling forgotten. They're lying there tonight, replaying every conversation they walked away from, every moment they chose pride over presence, every time they saw your name light up their screen and convinced themselves that waiting one more day wouldn't matter. And the weight of all those unmade calls is finally catching up with them. See, what you don't know yet is that the silence you've been interpreting as indifference has actually been the sound of someone wrestling with their own reflection, someone finally being forced to confront the difference between what they thought they wanted and what their soul has been crying out for all along. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon tells us there's a time for everything, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. And sometimes the silence isn't rejection, it's just the universe making space for both of you to grow into the people who can actually handle what's coming. I've seen it happen too many times to call it coincidence anymore. The person who needed to leave so they could understand what they left behind, who needed distance so they could see clearly what proximity had blurred, who needed to lose you so they could realize that everything else they were chasing was just noise compared to what you offered without even trying. Tonight, while you're wondering if you should delete their number or finally send that text you've rewritten 47 times, they're sitting with the kind of regret that only comes when someone realizes they've been running from the one thing that felt like home. And I know that doesn't make the loneliness easier right now, doesn't fill the space on the other side of your bed, doesn't quiet the questions that wake you up at 3 in the morning asking what you did wrong. But listen to me carefully. Their late-night confession isn't going to sound like the movies. It's not going to be poetic or perfectly timed or accompanied by a grand gesture that makes everything make sense. It's going to sound like someone who's been humbled, someone who's learned the hard way that the grass isn't greener anywhere else because they've been watering dead lawns while ignoring the garden they already had. You want to know what they're confessing in the darkness while you're asking God why this still hurts so much? They're confessing that they thought they needed freedom when what they really needed was to grow up. They're confessing that they mistook your patience for weakness and your kindness for something they could take for granted. They're confessing that every person they've tried to replace you just reminded them of all the ways you were different, all the ways you saw them when everyone else just looked at them, all the ways you loved them before they even knew how to love themselves. And confession, real confession, the kind that transforms people, it doesn't happen on your schedule. It happens when someone finally gets tired enough of pretending, lonely enough in crowds, empty enough despite all the distractions they've surrounded themselves with. David understood this when he wrote in Psalm 51 about having a broken and contrite heart, about how God doesn't despise that kind of authentic surrender, that kind of raw honesty that only comes when we stop performing and start being real about where we are. Your person is getting there, trust me, even if you can't see it yet. They're in that uncomfortable middle space where the life they built without you isn't working anymore, but the pride that drove them away hasn't fully released its grip. And I need you to understand something crucial while you're in your own middle space, your own waiting room, your own season of wondering if you're foolish for still caring. This time apart isn't about punishment, it's about preparation. Because the relationship you're going to have with them when they finally come back with their confession isn't going to look like what you had before, and that's actually a blessing, even though it doesn't feel like one yet. What you had before was built on who you both were then, and you're not those people anymore. You've been refined by this absence in ways you don't even recognize yet, learning how to stand on your own, how to find joy that isn't dependent on someone else's presence, how to hear God's voice when it's the only voice filling the silence. And they've been refined too, even though their refining fire looks different than yours, even though they chose it by walking away, even though every burned bridge and dead-end road they traveled was one they didn't have to take. Sometimes people need to learn through experience what they refuse to learn through wisdom, and that's between them and God, not between you and your worth. Because here's what I need you to hear before we go any further: their absence doesn't diminish your value. Read that again until it settles somewhere deeper than your mind, until it reaches the part of you that's been questioning whether you were enough, whether you loved too hard, whether you should have been different, better, less. In Song of Solomon, we read about love that's strong as death, passion that's fierce as the grave, about how many waters cannot quench love and rivers cannot sweep it away. And that's the kind of love that's worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth becoming your best self for. But it's also the kind of love that requires both people to show up whole, healed, ready. Not perfect, because perfection isn't the goal, and anybody selling you perfection is selling you a fantasy, but whole enough to know that another person can complement your life without having to complete it, present enough to show up for the hard conversations, healed enough to stop bleeding on people who didn't cut you. Your person's late-night confession is going to include all the ways they weren't ready before, all the ways they needed this time, even though they didn't know it, all the ways God was working on them in the wilderness while you were learning to trust Him in yours. And if you could hear what they're really wrestling with right now, you'd understand that this isn't about you not being enough. It's about them finally realizing that they weren't enough for what you deserved. That's the confession that changes everything. Not an "I miss you" in a shallow way, nostalgic about the past without taking responsibility for how it ended, but an "I wasn't ready for you then, and I'm doing the work now to become someone who is." That kind of honesty doesn't come cheap, doesn't come fast, doesn't come without them trying everything else and finding it all wanting. I've sat with too many people who received that late-night call, that unexpected text, that showing up at the door moment, and every single time, the ones who used their waiting season wisely were the ones who could receive that confession from a place of strength instead of desperation. Because desperation says, "Finally, I've been waiting for you to validate me." But strength says, "I'm glad you're here, and I'm not the same person you left, so let's figure out if who we've become can build something better than what we had." See the difference? One is rooted in need, one is rooted in choice, and God isn't interested in relationships built on need, because need breeds resentment, breeds codependency, breeds the kind of love that withers the moment circumstances change. Choice, though, choice built on two people who could be happy alone but choose to be better together, that's the foundation that can weather storms. And I know you're tired of being strong right now, tired of working on yourself while they're out there doing whatever they're doing, tired of choosing growth when all you want is to choose them. But Paul reminds us in Romans that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And that hope doesn't put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts. You're not suffering for nothing, friend. Every tear you've cried into your pillow while wondering if they're thinking about you has been watering seeds you didn't even know you were planting. Every night you chose to pray instead of text, to journal instead of stalk their social media, to process instead of pretend you're fine. Those were acts of radical self-love that your future self is going to thank you for. Because when their confession finally comes, whenever it comes, however it looks, you're going to meet it from a place of wholeness, not emptiness, from a place of choice, not desperation, from a place of peace, not chaos. Because that's what this season has been teaching you all along, that your peace isn't dependent on someone else's presence, that your joy isn't conditional on someone else's choices, that your worth is not up for negotiation based on who stays and who goes. You're learning to be complete in yourself, rooted in God, secure in your identity, and that's the foundation that can support any relationship worth having. So take a deep breath, release the anxiety about their confession or lack thereof, and remember that you're held by something bigger than this situation, loved by someone who will never leave, valued by the one who created you with purpose and sees you with eyes of infinite compassion. Their late-night confession is just a moment in time, but who you're becoming is eternal, and that's where your focus belongs, not on what they're finally ready to admit, but on what you're continuing to build, create, and step into. The best is yet to come, friend, for both of you, whether together or apart, and that's a confession you can make with confidence, with faith, with peace.